On this episode of In the House, Michael and I sit down with John Hart of Blackland Collaborative to discuss their work as the experts in green roofs and landscape restoration throughout the state of Texas. We talk at length about John's own pocket prairie, as it's called, as well as John's role as the host of the PBS show Central Texas Gardner. We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you do, please share the podcast with a friend. Thanks for listening. Upgrade your construction layouts with trademarks. These heavy-duty vinyl markers are designed to withstand harsh job site conditions. They're durable, waterproof, and perfect for marking locations for electrical, plumbing, HVAC, and more. Available in trade-specific colors, trademarks make communication with your team simple, professional, and reliable. Whether you're recording benchmarks, elevations, or center lines, trademarks ensure your layouts stay intact, even under heavy traffic. New customers enjoy 15% off at checkout. Visit trademarklayout.com to get yours today.
Welcome to this episode of In the House podcast. Thanks, John, for coming on today and talking with us. I've got the pleasure of seeing a little bit of your work at the CRAN networking event where. Yep. And that's how I came across Blackland Collaborative and you guys and this amazing green roof that you guys have put on this house. But just high level, get a little background of you and your work and Blackland and how you got into projects like that.
Sure. So Blackland technically started about 2020. But it's proud to say it's a women-owned business. So it's myself and two partners, Emily Manderson and Michelle Bertelson.
It's awesome.
And we all met because we were all working for the landscape restoration program at the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, which was
cool.
Started in about 2000. And that program was essentially, it did three things. It carried out research. So we started a program that's now the longest running prescribed fire research program in the United States. It's still going on, where we're looking, we have research plots. Essentially, we look if we put fire back on the landscape or if we mow to mimic grazing like the bison. If you just do those things at different seasons, is that enough to help push a abused ranch land back towards what's called a climax condition?
Wow.
And that's not with reseeding or anything like that. It's just like if we bring these disturbance conditions back, will that help? And we can talk about that later, sort of what that means. But
that sounds like a whole rabbit trail, right?
Yeah,
we're probably not going to have a long time.
So we started that research. So we do research like that. We did research on green roofs.
Yeah.
So how we got into green roofs, we essentially had a lot of manufacturers approach us and say, our systems are not working here. They are failing. What's the deal? So we embarked upon about 9 years of research to figure out what the issues was. And big shocker, it's hot as hell. So
you're on the roof in Texas.
So there's non-native sedums, which were a big focus, and the way the roofs were set up.
Yeah,
it was developed in a temperate climate like Germany or the UK, and here it's just a whole different game. So we figured out after 9 years how to go about that. So those are just a few of them. We worked and did technical reports for like the water quality improvement lands that the city of Austin owns. They asked the question of they bought all this land that had aquifers on it. So karst features that directly recharge our aquifer. And they wanted to know, okay, now that we have this land, that's not enough. How do we ensure fast, clean recharge of that aquifer? And after doing all that, Michelle Bertelson, one of my partners, was a key driver of helping figure out pushing it back towards a grassland condition. Because if you have a bunch of trees like ash juniper, not that those are bad things, those are native trees, but because the bison aren't there, because the fire isn't there, they've overpopulated. And so you get what's called canopy intercept. So the rainwater hits the top of the canopy and never makes it into the ground because it usually will evaporate off.
Oh, interesting.
So now they're managing their lands to actually restore the lands.
That's cool.
So research like that. We also taught as part of the University of Texas landscape architecture program.
Sweet.
An architecture program, helping them understand why ecology, what sort of important role that it needs to play within design. To sort of wrest design away from a mere aesthetic and to a function-based approach.
Super important.
And then also we did consulting, so we would refer to ourselves as the center outside of the center's walls, right? The center is a beautiful place to visit. There's research going on. There's beautiful gardens. That's great. But Mrs. Johnson's legacy is one of impact beyond that, right? You plant the seed and then it grows and it spreads. So that's sort of what we did. So we were there for quite some time. And then in 2000, the executive director at the time, COVID hit, and then he decided to dissolve our program. And at that point, we had a lot of active contract works out there. And I said, this is important work. I want to keep doing this. We're going to take that business. He said, that's wonderful. Let's do it. So that's awesome. How we became a private entity.
Love it.
So that's sort of the long story sort of component of how we formed. And we're a weird niche group because Emily and myself have a master's in landscape architecture. So we understand the design world. Michelle has a background in parks and recreation and ecology. So the big thing with those two worlds is the designers get all these contracts to fundamentally redefine our cities. But in design school, you don't really get taught the nuts and bolts anymore, especially in landscape architecture. Architects learn to make furniture. They start to study materials and all this. You don't really get in there and get your hands dirty the way I'd liken it to like getting a master's or a degree in like fine art, but just studying the theory, right? You understand what's good and what makes cohesive stuff, but like to actually do that, like to make it real, to build, that's a whole different thing. So
I have a background in architecture.
Okay,
and I went to architecture school, and so it definitely understand a lot of what you're saying there in terms of me stepping into industry, and learning the practical side. There were some major hurdles there. It's
sort of a larger trend with design schools, but I do feel like other than landscape architects, they don't quite get that experience. Part of that's just because the landscape grows over time, and you're only in design school for a couple of years, right?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, right, totally. Sort of thing like when you plant a tree, you plant a tree in whose shade you'll never stand.
Right? 100%.
So that's understandable, but you've got to start like. When I had friends at our architectural school, they would go and they would weld stuff or even making furniture. When you start to make things, it fundamentally rewires your brain.
100%.
100%. And so that's the thing. I think that their big thing was you're gonna move. We're not going to teach you about plants here because you're going to go work for this architect in Oregon or California or something. They'll teach you about plants there, and I feel that that's a big disservice. Because you got to start to know what you're working with, right? And it's something that you've got to start to learn because it takes time. You don't just study a book and then you understand plants, like the ID plants. You've got to understand little nuances. You've got to see there's variations on that theme. And you've got to get in there and it takes time to build that. It's like a memory muscle, muscle memory or something like
100%.
that, right? Like riding a bike. You're not going to just get it.
Right.
But it'll eventually click, but you've got to use those muscles in your brain. But the ecology, so the designers get these wonderful contracts to fix the world or fix cities rather.
The urban planning,
right? All that. So, but they're like green stuff here or prairie here or forest here. But what does that really mean, right? What's the nuts and bolts? Ecologists on the other side of the spectrum, they're doing this data. They're creating this amazing data out of their research projects, but it's not really applied. It's something that they're always wanting more data because there's one thing with science, and I think we see this culturally, right? Like there's never a definitive final answer for a scientist, right? You always get more data. More data is even better because you get a better approach. But that's somewhat done us a disservice because you're sort of afraid to do something. And at this point in the world, in the landscape, like the world's on fire.
Yeah.
We've got to do something, right? So be educated and try not, Hippocratic Oath, do no harm.
Yeah.
But we got to start doing stuff. So our firm bridges those two, the design and the ecology, so that you have the data, you're making data-driven decisions, but you're also doing it in a way that is going to have effect, whether that's clean air, clean water, carbon sequestration, heat island mitigation, habitat, all that sort of stuff.
One thing that really, when you were talking the other day at that Grand Network, what struck me was something that we talk about often on the podcast is this kind of idea of built different, and there's kind of a necessary step that people need to take to hone their craft, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, how are you separating yourself and really honing your craft, understanding, like you're talking about, the nuts and bolts of what you're doing,
right?
And so I was like, oh man, I see some threads of that in what John's saying. So that's cool to hear you take this, explain it like that. Of, hey, we've got people in these two different worlds, kind of backgrounds in the design side and background in the hard science side, and combining those, and how do we take that in a practical sense and make the world a better place? Right.
And if you think about a construction team, just my exposure to working with, we're not architects. I couldn't tell you how to build.
Yeah.
I mean, I can weld some stuff roughly. If you'll make some good scrap art, I'm your man. But I don't know, the fine detail that goes on a house, but I do know that involves multiple entities, all craftspeople working together as a team, right? Yeah. And that's not unlike the what I was talking about between ecologists and designers, right?
Yeah.
There needs to be this team effort, because not one person can't know everything.
Yeah.
Right? So it's really about cultivating
it's a team effort.
Mindset and a group, so that you're working and achieving something that is, whether you want to call it craft or what we really focus a lot on is function. It's a functional outcome that's going to, yes, address your high-level concern of, I want, for instance, the green roof, I want a roof. But it's, for us, it's like, okay, again, it's pollinator habitat, it's heat island mitigation, it's stormwater management, it's R value for the house or the building. Yeah. So we want to do all of those things. Yeah. So it's working in a way that we work with that larger team, so we help achieve, the end result.
What's as a firm, what's y'all's bread and butter project? I mean, is it the green roofs that y'all do the most of, or is it like research projects or working with the state or city on? Yeah. So green roofs are not our bread and butter. They're kind of a one-off, but it's just because we are uniquely positioned, and having done all that research. The first green roof project we did was in 2012, and it was called Edgeland. It was with Bercy Chin Architects. It won a lot of awards. Yeah, I've seen that one.
East Austin. It's a really amazing. I call
Great
it
project.
The Modern Hobbit. Is what I call it.
It's super cool.
It's really kind of a house that only could have come about in Austin. The owner's a good friend, Chris Brown.
That's awesome.
And Augustina. It's Apple TV did a series called Home. And it's on one of the first seasons, and it's a lovely love story between Augustina, who was working on the project with Bercy Chin, but then her and Chris end up becoming in love with one another. It's a really
wild.
great. So it's really this labor of love.
Oh, that's so cool.
But he's an attorney, but he's also this amazing science fiction author, and now he's written some new books that are really dealing with these, what he calls these interstitial spaces or edgelands, that are these urban ecologies, which aren't perfect or whatever, but they have their own diversity in themselves, and they have a lot of artifacts from, leftover, like there's, by his house there was a car that was in the Colorado River. Like, he's interested in this really strange new thing that's developing. So that's not our bread and butter, but we do those because I think they're wonderful. Each of those roofs, to jump back a little to technical talk.
Yeah.
We know can hold on to 100% of a quarter-inch rain event. Well, what does that mean? Well, in Central Texas, we're flash flood alley because we have shallower soils, especially in the hill country.
Mm-hmm.
And in urban areas, you get a lot of impermeable space because it's concrete and asphalt and So we're exacerbating a flash flood problem. If we were to put out, a lot of green roofs within our urban cores, our average rainfall events in these storms are about 1/4 of an inch.
Sure.
We certainly have 4 inches or 5 inches. Now, these roofs will shed waters like any other roof, but for our average rainfall event, if we put this in large scale, we could capture 100% of that and hold on to it and not exacerbate that flash flooding. So, again, that's one of the benefits that they could have. But back to your question, our main bread and butter, so to speak, is ecological restoration. So we work with developers. We work with, sometimes we'll do residential, depending. We're really better for larger scale. But we'll work with states, cities, the federal government on projects that are looking to restore. We're really expert in grassland restoration, but there's riparian, so along rivers. There's woodland as well. So we understand that, and we work all over. We've got projects in Chattanooga, Bentonville, Arkansas, a lot over in Texas. We impacted over 90,000 acres in the state of Texas.
That's amazing.
That's sweet.
But again, this is how we were sort of formed and trained up by our directors at the time. Dr. Steve Windhager is now the director at the Santa Barbara Botanical Gardens of California, and Dr. Mark Simmons, who passed away a number of years back while we were still at the center. But they were really uniquely positioned to say this sort of work. They were part of that. Like this this landscape ecology approach needs to be applied. And so they were really drivers as part of that. And they worked. Steve worked with AMD on some of their early properties on the contributing zones of the aquifer, so west of Austin, and developed relationships and cultivated that. So we're really helping out these larger parks and natural lands. We're trying to figure out as a private entity how to do more research because it's a little bit different of a world, but we have some projects that we're slowly going along with. But mainly it's this sort of larger landscape restoration. But we're sort of like we're gunslingers. If you have prairie, we're going to come to you, or if you want to do prairie, and again, the green roofs are just an extension of that.
Sure.
Yeah.
When we do a project with a green roof, we will look at the site, and we will research what the historic soils were, and then from that we will figure out what the historic climax plant community was on that site. So what were the grasses, the wildflowers, trees, shrubs, so on and forth, that were there when it was its most biodiverse, when the bison and the Comanche were roaming free.
Yeah.
And we will form our seed mixes for those roofs from that based on the scale. So we see those as a pivotal way to get biodiversity back into urban environments. So it is landscape restoration. It's just on a smaller scale.
Yeah, and I wanted to go into a little bit, before we get into the restoration part of what y'all do, you had mentioned earlier that like people were seeking y'all out because they were having failures. And what did you mean by failures? Was it for green roofs, was it a water leak issue? Was it a structural issue? Was it just, hey, nothing survives up there? That's it? Yeah.
The latter.
Okay.
Yes. It was, everything was dying.
Okay.
And so to sort of go through it briefly, and we do brown bag luncheons for architecture firms, sort of explain to them why, because there are a lot of big nationwide green roof businesses that will pass up business in this neck of the woods because they know, they've experienced it, they've tried it.
Interesting.
And we will sort of get called out because people know, like over the years, like these guys have done it. They figured it out. It's the heat, like we mentioned. We set up about 24 units that were built like a typical commercial detail, and it was about a 5x6 or so space. It was like a TPO system, just what a typical detail of what you'd see on a commercial building.
Totally.
And we were looking at extensive roofs. So there are intensive green roof systems and they're extensive. Intensive are like if you're going to put 3 feet up there of media.
Oh, interesting.
So if you do that, heat's not going to be an issue because you've got so much thing. But the problem is, if you're doing that, there's going to be a significant cost to carry a load like that, right?
It's a weight.
So that's not all that practical. Extensive systems are anything that can be essentially. There's an official definition of it, but we won't do anything shallower than 5 inches, and then we've gone up to 12 inches.
Okay.
And the official definition's a little bit narrower than that, but that's what we call an extensive system. And if you're building a new building, to carry that saturated load, that it really doesn't add a lot of cost to the structure to do that. If you know going in,
that's cool.
It's not economically feasible to retrofit. We've had a lot of people say, "Oh, I want to do a green roof." Your home or your business has been designed to carry a specific load, which is just that TPO or asphalt shingle or whatever on it, which ain't nothing.
Yeah.
That's going to be expensive to retrofit.
Right.
But for new structures, not crazy to do this. It's not going to really add that much cost. And so we built 24 of these units, and then we tested the actual product. So some of those were basically, if you look at the very simplified green roof, there's usually a drainage mat. They would have put some sort of root barrier thingy, and then they'd have media, and then they'd have their plants. There's also another one that people are really interested in because it seems easy, which is like a modular tray system.
Mm-hmm.
So these like little trays that are maybe like 1 by 2 or 1 by 1 or something.
You pop them in.
And it's sort of like, you just load that and then it makes it easier to install. So getting into the heat, we had thermocouples that were measuring on the surface of the media, within the middle of the media, and at the bottom of the drainage mat. And what we found when it was 100-something degrees, 113 degrees during the summer, it was just baking, especially down that lower layer. The drainage mat that was typically done at the time looked like an egg carton. So it has concave and convex. And sort of the idea was, engineers don't want hydrostatic pressure buildup because they don't want leaks, right? It needs to shed water. But in that concern, what we found when they were doing those, a few inches of media depth, that 1.5 to 2 inch air gap, when it was 100-something degrees, it was getting 90 to 95 degrees. At 90 degrees, right next to the plant's roots, that plant shuts down. It's like, what's going on? Because the roots are never supposed to get that hot. Not even near that. And then at 95 above, you have plant mortality.
Wow.
So that was internal heat gain that was a huge issue that we saw. The other thing was, as I mentioned earlier, was they were using, there's an over-reliance on these non-native sedums. And that's because those sedum plants are really great. They're succulents, essentially. They're really great. They retain water. But the way that they photosynthesize is a 2-part cycle. And one of that is, at night, it has to drop below 80 degrees Fahrenheit for them to open up their stomata and then respirate. And you can guess what happens in the summer, and especially more increasingly
Never happens.
It doesn't drop below 80. So you had a punch from below and a punch from above, and it was just eventually wailing. And again, it's not that it just failed outright every time.
Yeah.
But over time, it would start to hit, and you would start to see it weaken and weaken and weaken. Or there might be an extreme event, and it would just die. So then you start to have weeds coming in. It was liability and all that. So we figured all that out. And then essentially we looked at and said, could we solve this with native plants? Yes, we think so. And we started testing different species mixes. And at first we tried to model it off of their approach and said, what's a few things we think that'll work? Because if you go to Enchanted Rock, the park out there, you'll go on a granitic dome that's up on the top. And so it's just a big hunk of granite sitting there. But there are depressions out there. And we have pictures of this in our presentation. We always look to nature for inspiration, but also for for just the facts of life, because you know what? It's technology that's been evolved over millions of years. Like, just go with the flow. Don't figure that you have to reinvent the wheel. You're not that smart. You know, this stuff's been set up. So you go on the top of there and you'll notice there are these little depressions, and there's these little communities of plants, and it's little blue stems and purple threon and opuntia, so prickly pear, and all that. There's this whole wild mix of species. There's some native sedums like coastal stonecrop that are in there, and that's just built up through organic debris blowing in there. Detritus. That is essentially an extensive green roof that's up there.
Sure, yeah.
It has no irrigation, and it is thriving. And so that's what it's like. If this can happen here, then we can model this, right? Yeah. And so that's sort of what we started keying off with. And then, because we were, into sustainability as well, a lot of the green roof growing media that we saw was, had a lot of it was mined material. So there's a big carbon footprint association with that. But then the sustainable mixes had like coconut core fibers. Well, they're great, but where are the great coconut core plantations of Texas? They're not here. Yeah. So there's the same carbon footprint because you got to ship all the stuff in. So we mixed this mix, and we figured out, the YouTube Bureau of Economic Geology looked at it, and they said, well, this one ingredient that you have in here is really good at regulating thermal. We had put in there because we knew it had, if you looked at it microscopically, had a lot of pore space, so it would hold on to water. We put it in there for that reason, but then we found out that it was also really good at regulating these thermal loads. So we put all that back in. We used a drainage mat that's much smaller. It maybe has like 5/8 of an inch thickness. So we shrunk that air gap down, and then we went to a native pallet. And what we soon started to see is in nature, there's what's called ecological succession. So there's tons of species growing in this area. And then if a fire comes through, or drought, or a freeze, or a pathogen, or whatever, that might affect a certain percentage of that population. But those go away. But guess what? There's 50 other, especially in prairies, there's 50 other species to fill that gap behind that. So that's what we try to mirror with our green roofs, is that's awesome. We will try to get as many as we can. So we've gotten 60, almost, I think on some of the larger ones, like 70-something species of grasses and wildflowers up there. And it basically gives us that that's where resilience comes from, is biodiversity.
Yeah.
Biodiversity isn't some hippy dippy stuff, right? It's real. Like it is a evolutionary response to external pressures. So that's sort of how we develop. Now our prairie green roofs, we do have drip irrigation on them because these are drought tolerant native species, but the way that they deal with drought is some of these will send their roots down 20 feet plus.
Oh, wow.
So they can go dormant when it gets hot and dry for a decade or something, even more. So we can't do that. We're doing 5 inches at the shallowest, or 12 inches. So we need to give it something. So during the fall, in the winter, in the spring, if everything's behaving okay, you might not have to really water it all that often. But in the summer, when it's really intense, especially we've had these summers where it's been 3 months of no rain and 100 degrees, we've got to at least give it a pulse. Now, we'll give it a 5-minute pulse, though. That's it. We're not sitting out there running it for 30 minutes or whatever. So that helps get that. And then again, then that allows you to have with that, if you do something really well in restoration, then you're getting other benefits too. So we're making a sound, resilient roof system that's going to satisfy the aesthetic goals, but we're getting pollinator habitat, we're getting stormwater control, there's R value for the building, all that sort of thing. So, so that's sort of our approach. When we talk about the failure, is basically they're just dying. And then when you have bare growing media up on a roof, that's part of that succession too, is Mother Nature abhors a void. So if there's a growing availability up there, she's going to try to stick something up there. In urban areas, it tends to be invasive species. So some of the early roofs that we saw that were put in, this before we embarked on our research, they just died out, and it would just become full of weeds. And that's sort of where we were like, well, how do you maintain? And that's why a lot of people just say, like, man, we can't do this.
Well, what's wrong with that? Do you not get the same benefits
from that system, even if it's weeds, than you do from native species?
I would say probably no. It's probably going to be annuals. It's not going to function on the same level. I can't say we have not done a 1-to-1 to say like, okay, we didn't do an invasive laden roof and say, what is this doing? Mm-hmm. But what I can tell you is invasive dominated systems tend to be extremely less biodiverse.
Okay.
So it's going to tend to be one or a couple of species. And so again, we just talked about what's the great thing about putting a grassland or a prairie back on the roof is that resilience. Mm-hmm. This thing is going to just get a hammer at one point in time. We don't know when, but it will. And then it's going to basically be a reset, and then it will maybe start back. Mm. So it is, and some of these invasives are so successful not only because they grow faster, they have shorter flowering cycles, but it's also because of things like they're allelopathic, and that basically means they'll poison the soil, so it's only good for their growth. Or they will hijack the biological development of the soil around them. And so if you look at how in ecology, how grasslands, or you evolve from a grassland to woodland, there's a distinct biological microbial community that's associated with that. It's not that the plants are just doing this. It's a symbiotic relationship. And if you look at bare soil, it starts out, there's nothing there. And then if you track it over time, it's bacteria dominant. And then once you get to a mature grassland, it's about 50-50 bacteria, fungi. There's also protozoa and all this other stuff, but just make this really simple.
Yeah.
It's
dumb it down for us.
Well, no, it's just, there's a lot of stuff you can get into.
Yeah, I'm sure.
But there's the bacteria and the fungi, so the mycorrhizae that we've heard a lot about that are so amazing. And then as you go to woodland, then it becomes like fungally dominant. So what a lot of these invasives, like Johnson grass, for example, it will lock it into where it's essentially just bacteria dominant. So it wants to be like an immature system forever. And what we want in that succession too is when we start some of our roofs, you're going to see certain species those first few years. And then after you start to go over time, it's going to switch over into a mature grassland. So little blue stem, big blue stem, Indian grass. Those are all what are called obligatorily mycorrhizal. So that's cool. They can't grow unless they can establish a symbiotic relationship with that mycorrhizae. And we can't get that going. It's something that occurs over time. So I liken it to, and this is just generally in restoration. We always say at Blackland that restoration is a trajectory, not an intervention. So you can give me all the ingredients, say, hey, make me a cake, and I can put them in a bowl and mix them up and say, here you go. Is that a cake? You're going to be like, what the hell? No, we've got to put it in the oven, and then we've got to have time. It's the temporal aspect that allows us to mature.
That's good.
So, and a part of that, too, is then we always have a maintenance manual that we'll put out with the roofs as well to help guide that. And we have a subcontractor here in Austin that we work with to help take care of these roofs.
Oh, that's great.
Train them up. Yeah. Because it does involve a lot of plant ID, so you need to know the invasives. But like I mentioned, like some of our roofs might have 50, 60 species. You've got to at least kind of know what you're seeing, especially in the beginning. So, but yeah, I don't think that you can absolutely go out into the world, not even the roofs, and see the challenge with biodiversity that we're having, this collapse. And a majority of our landscape is now invasive stuff. And that has a profound effect on human health and well-being. There's oodles of data out there, and why many hospitals now are focusing, part of their initiative is for people to look out and see a thriving landscape out their window. They know that patients will feel less pain, they will heal faster, and the hospital becomes more efficient. And it's because we are nature. Again, not a hippy-dippy thing. That plant, there's a wonderful author and restorationist named Benjamin Vogt, who I interviewed recently, and looking through some of his books, which he's super great. But, you know, the difference between blood and chlorophyll is like only one molecule. And plants' blood essentially can take in light, whereas ours takes in oxygen. So we're not that far off. We are nature. So if we can make our cities more biodiverse, then we are going to be healthier for it. And we also stop positioning our everything that we do as what's the benefit of humans. We start to say what makes sense for
the world,
all.
Yeah.
Right. And again, and then out of that, you're also getting cleaner water, cleaner air, carbon sequestration, all these benefits. So function. So again, we go back to always at the end of the day is how is this functioning? So I can guarantee you that, and while I don't have 100% data laid in front of you, if you have a green roof or if you have a landscape and it's full of invasives, it is not going to be functioning like what a biodiverse restored system would.
Sure. I was wanting to get into more of the like the restoration part of what y'all do.
Yep.
If you could kind of expand on that a little bit, like when you say restoration, like what exactly do you mean by that?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. So, like we've been discussing, so ecological restoration is an attempt to rest the trajectory of a landscape more closer akin to what it would have been during its, again, that historic climax condition. So when for a majority of folks, and me included before I started working at the Wildflower Center, you look out and you see a lot of green stuff and you think, that's green, that's great. And it's not. It's really, really not. And part of the one thing, if anybody listens to this, or me rather, and decides to go in and get into ecology, you're opening up your eyes to a world of wounds, as Aldo Leopold would say. It's really disturbing. You start to drive around and start to be able to see, like a doctor can read a person and say, like, woo, those spots aren't from the sun. It's 'cause of I can say a very specific reason why they. So
we talk about that in building all the time.
Yeah.
It's ignorance is bliss.
So you assume it's green, it's good, but it's usually invasive dominated, or it's like an example, like with the ash juniper. Like a lot of people has a love-hate relationship. They're a native species here. They're out of whack because the wildfire is not here. We've extirpated the wildfire. We've extirpated the grazers like the bison. And so we fundamentally changed up with the hill country, for example, what's called a patchwork mosaic. Instead of just coverage of dense brush, you had there was dense pockets and then open pockets of grassland and whatnot. And in Austin, you really had, it's what's called an ecotone. So that's convergence of two distinct ecosystems. And those ecotones are really where stuff starts cooking, because you have species starting to intermix that are within those. Each of those zones have a lot of species that are very distinct to those regions. But when they come together, then you have a lot of crossover where it just becomes even more diverse.
Wow.
So when we look out, people are asking us, for a lot of the time, it's aesthetic. The sort of the hook is like, we would like to have wildflowers, which kind of makes us, one of the things we really get unnerved about is like, I really want bluebonnets. We're like, oh man, I love bluebonnets.
Yeah.
But but that's also the hook, right? Okay, well, let's help you do that.
Yeah.
But then we've got to work them into their site preparation. So we've got to try to eradicate as much of those invasives as we can, because of all the things that we were talking about before, that because they can poison the soil, they can hijack the biogeochemical properties of the soil and not allow it to move towards that more biodiverse native condition. So we will work with that, try to get that done. That's a lot of site prep that takes time, which a lot of folks don't want to do. They want, we'll go out there and
tomorrow.
We'll do it. And then it's there, and it's like, no, we will usually try to say, like, can we take a year? Because there's also warm season invasives and there's cool season invasives. So even if you're to annihilate all the Johnson grass on a site, which you won't, then comes early spring, you'll have brome and all these other species that would just launch and take over.
You know what I can't get out of my head is this term invasives. Like, we consider them invasive, but to nature, wouldn't that just be nature doing its thing? Like, why are invasives, quote unquote, bad? Isn't that just nature doing what it does? And
no, that's a great question. So again, there are folks who are writing books that have a very strong argument to say, look, this is now an issue where we can't make a change. It's so large of a challenge that it can't be happened. And Mother Nature's, we're just going to let her cook, and she's going to invent a new ecosystem. And that doesn't sit right with me. I think if you look at, it's not just just, okay, the native stuff isn't here, this stuff's here. There's problems with that too. So it's not just that there's a lack of biodiversity, which again there's a direct correlation between human health and well-being there. But that also starts to have a domino effect on other species like pollinators, which are responsible for our food pollination and production.
Sure.
That's a threat to our food. That also starts to then start a domino effect within the trophic hierarchy of how animals and insects that are, one species collapse leads to another, then another, then another. We're in a really serious time of diversity of they're calling it maybe the sixth mass extinction. So it's not Mother Nature just doing this stuff. It's happened because of people. In 1783, Thomas Jefferson writes a letter to one of his friends in I think somewhere in Europe, in Paris maybe, and he's like, our grasses here in Virginia are Timothy, Lucerne, and New Guinea grass. 1783 in America, all of the grasses he mentioned are not native. We're already having a profound effect in the latter part of the 18th century, bringing in stuff with all of our food crops and all that, and these other seed are jumping on and taking off. You look at not just plants, but you look at other animals where you get these invasives coming in, like the emerald ash borer, for instance. We're about to not have any more ash trees. They're just going to be gone, and it's going to happen fast.
Yeah.
So the question of the invasive isn't just. Yes, Mother Nature is trying to figure stuff out, but then you tack that on with challenges like climate change and other impacts. And it's really, we've got nature up on the ropes. I don't think that we can have a philosophical discussion that some folks are having about shouldn't we just let it happen? Because again, I can point to you and show you that where you're having erosion issues, or you're having, and this to me is a more nefarious thing. So you look at, like with lawns. Lawn is really just what I call an aesthetic. I mean, we love lawns, but there's social issues which we could get into. It evolved out of essentially aristocracy. They could afford to have land that wasn't working back in the day. They could just say, you know what? Look at my wealth. I can just have this lawn where we can play cricket on or whatever, and that was there. And then, yes, lawns are great. I love it. I have a little patch for my kids where we can play some soccer. But I also have a significant portion of my yard that I have restored to prairie and allow the biodiversity, because it's a yes and approach, right? It's not an either or. And I think, tribalism is a major issue around the world right now. And we've got to get back onto the yes and approach, right? Diversity is a negative word, but it's not in nature. So jump back to the lawns. The lawn is an industry where you use some cities use over 60-70% of their potable drinking water irrigating lawns.
That's crazy.
I mean, that's a direct threat.
And some strange.
And some of those, like Bermuda grass, which is one of the invasive species.
I mean, sorry to jump in, but on one of the things is, like children playing, for example, or the past decade or so has changed dramatically. I mean, I'm driving by all these houses. There aren't people out using those lawns. It's like for the amount of effort that we're putting into those.
Yes.
What's the return on investment we're getting on those?
It's an aesthetic.
It's
right?
questionable.
And it's also psychological view of how you it's a controlled nature, because a lot of people, I don't like pocket prairies. It looks too weedy. It looks snaky, mosquito-y, whatever you want to say. But that's because you've been trained to say, I want clearing lines. I want everything to look in order. And some of that the prairie allows us to practice what I call the art of becoming or letting go. Is to understand I'm going to have a slice that I'm going to work with and manage it. And as I start to understand it, again, going back to plant blindness that we have right now, then I start to understand, okay, this isn't just, oh, wow, look at this. And it's dynamic and it changes. It takes effort, right? The other doesn't, except for the intensive landscape on life support strategy that you've got to take to maintain that. And like I was going to mention too, so the invasive stuff like Bermuda grass, huge, the go-to thing. That arrived in the United States because it was used as bedding on slave ships. So that's to me an artifact of terrible injustice. But it's also spreading so much because that's the go-to stuff. And a lot of the lawn stuff that's chosen is not just innocent in its sense. It's chosen because it grows voraciously, because it has high traffic. It need So, but let's take that step. So that's been happening for a long term. But now, what's the big trend with lawns, or that's going there? Well, I don't want to maintain it, so now I'm going to do we've moved past xeriscape.
That's what I was going to say. Xeriscape.
No.
I don't know what's
AstroTurf.
Oh yes, God.
Now we're putting plastic.
Yeah,
and so it's
so
this
bad.
downward spiral of how we, that I don't have to maintain. There's more plastic and the stuff.
Yeah.
So to me, it is not just a matter of just sitting back and saying it's all going to shake out. My response to that is, well, let's see how that works out for everybody, which is not going to be well, because again, it's a direct effect on that landscape is not helping out anything else. It's not food for animals. It might be some that they will, but it's not be as nutritious. If they do eat it, it's not going to help pollinators, which have a profound effect on, again, food production, all that. So to me, I always aim for biodiversity. If we can increase biomass and biodiversity, we're going to be doing great stuff. And we're going to feel the return. It's a return on your investment.
Yeah.
So yeah. I hope that's probably long-winded, but
no, I mean
great.
that makes some sense.
Yeah.
I mean, heck, I wish I could have a lawn. I got freaking rocks where I live. It's like, I know my kids. I got 2 young kids, and they use the heck out of our backyard. So having a nice lawn is great.
I think it's also to your comment about the blind to plants. Like, just personally, there's a lot of things that, like, I don't live in a climate like England, for example, where having a lawn, anyone and everyone can have a lawn without even trying, because the climate there is so much more to what people think of like the prototypical lawn, right? Nice soft grass.
Yeah.
Well,
we live in Texas,
yes.
And so what are the options? What are the options around making something that is kind of to your both and approach of, hey, fits our lifestyle, it has the aesthetic, like piece that we want, but also has the biodiversity, and it kind of brings these different pieces together.
Yeah. So again, that's part of that's how we approach things, right? And we're, again, being formed from the Wildflower Center is that it was always natives were invariably going to give us the answer. So one of the research projects we did for, again, turf, like we want something like that, we developed what's called HabiTurf, which you can buy at seed. We tried to get it developed to do with sod, but the sod manufacturers we went to, they're growing Bermuda and everything else. A lot of them were using well water, which was pretty saline, and it was affecting that. But you can get it as seed. The original mix that we tested that was the most successful had about 7 species of grasses in there. Not all of them were commercially available, even by seed. Mm-hmm. So the one that's out there is 3. It's buffalo grass, blue grama, and curly mesquite. And it will do very well, but it's not going to do as well as Bermuda or something because it's not just this insane amount of growth.
Yeah.
And we had people that are really interested and want to use it in Houston. A lot of the species that are in that mix were from, if you back up and if you look at the different types of grasslands, there's not just prairies. There's a lot of types of prairies out there. But to really simplify it, there's tall grass prairie in the eastern section of Texas and the United States. There's midgrass prairie, sort of in the middle sliver, and then there's short grass prairie. Why do y'all think? Why is it like that?
Probably water.
Yeah, precipitation. Exactly. So tall grass was East Texas, lots of rain, all that sort of stuff. Midgrass, sort of you're getting into central Texas and a little bit west where it's get some rain, but you get more drought. Short grass where it's really west into Colorado and all that, and where you tend to get more dry. So we have people in Houston want to use that, and we have to tell them, like, I think you're going to get too much rain. You're going to get root rot. There's going to be issues. But that's precisely the approach. So that we haven't figured out all of that. There's so much more to be done.
Yeah, that sounds complex.
But the answer is there.
Yeah.
It's just that there's a like, to go back to the turf, there's a turf industry that they're selling stuff that, the model is, if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Yeah, they're just
rolling. Their
it,
economic machine's moving.
Yeah.
And not only do they sell you turf,
that.
they sell you fertilizer, they sell you the fungicide, and every other thing that you got to put on that. That little bit of turf that I have, I've got to put tons of crap on there.
Yeah.
It drives me insane.
Yeah, I bet you got to dump all sorts of stuff.
But it's a very small sliver, so my kids can play soccer. Majority of my yard is tall midgrass prairie. I set it on fire once a year. I will thin it out. What I like to practice in my pocket prairie talks is you got to be the bison. You got to get in there, tear it up. It's not your grandmother's flower bed. Be that disturbance agent, and it will love you for it, and it will change over time. It's great. Yeah. And I can tell you, when I first got
time out. You set your lawn on fire.
Not my lawn. My lawn can't take it. I set parts of it.
Your backyard,
and to back up, I'm not advocating a lot of dangerous stuff. As part of the wildfire center,
actually, I love that personally. I think that is awesome.
I mentioned that we started the longest running prescribed wildfire research in the nation. Our group, not me.
Yeah.
But we are all trained in wildland firefighting.
That's
we
awesome.
did prescribed fires. So I know what I'm doing.
Yeah.
And I make it safe, and it's not
I love to think about you moving into a house. You go to meet the neighbor, and they're like, "By the way, I light my yard on fire every once in a while." But
I'm sure the neighbors,
I live in East Austin. I bought the property that I had in 2007 mainly because it was a big chunk of land. And I wanted to do restoration on it. And it was covered in invasive stuff, the first part of it.
It's perfect.
So I started my restoration efforts on my land, too, because I also want to practice what I preach.
Yeah,
and it's my
exactly.
lab, right?
Yeah.
Like,
you live it out, low stakes,
ground,
you can go to town. Yeah, that's
I don't want to
great.
just talk about this stuff.
Yeah.
I want to know it.
Mm-hmm.
And so
we do that in the building industry. Probably drive our families crazy a little bit, but
well, you got to do it.
You got to do it. Yeah.
So, but yeah, when I first started that, I'll never forget. I was burning, and there was a sweet family that had next to us that had been there for years, and they see this crazy guy.
Like, what
and
is
they
going
heard me
on
with
here?
A little prickly pear burner.
Yeah.
And just sticking the head out like, who moved in? A couple of years later, and then she starts to see all these wildflowers and all that, and she just pulled me aside and said, sweet little lady says, this is beautiful.
That's so awesome.
And so,
yeah.
And then now, what they don't look at, they're like, oh yeah, this is great.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, so I don't have to do all of that intensive stuff all the time that you have to do, like with lawns. And again, I don't know about all this stuff, but it's like people talk about big pharma and all this. They're selling you something to whatever.
Yeah.
I agree with I love doctors and I love scientists, so I'm not an anti-scientist. But I do feel there is something where an industry sets up, not a science, but an industry.
Yeah.
Then it's not just that they're selling you lawn, they're selling you all of these products. And we did have one time when we were presenting about HabiTurf at the Wildflower Center, we had a bunch of turf folks come in, and I heard one of the folks, I might say from which company, but you've definitely heard the name, said this is a direct threat.
Wow.
Because it's a different way. But again, to your question, it's there. All of the answers have not been found yet, but they're there.
Yeah.
Right. And again, it's just part of that too. The only driver from that is a desire from the consumer for something different, to know, to ask. And so culturally, if you've been told this is what makes a pretty landscape or makes a beautiful home, you want the soup du jour.
Sure.
But the problem is some of those soup du jours have been a legacy for a long time. So to your point about, we were formed to have an evergreen landscape. Well, in certain parts of the United States, large portions, it doesn't do that.
That's not how it works.
It's evolved for drought. It's evolved for fire, flood.
Yeah.
It goes dormant.
Yeah.
We say all the time, you've got to get down with brown. It's not a negative thing. That is a strength of our plant communities. So you don't have to have these landscapes on life support. So we don't have to spend 70% of our drinking water trying to keep something so it looks like, Canterbury or whatever. I mean, but it's deeply ingrained in us culturally.
Yeah.
I mean, Andrew Jackson Downing is one of the first folks who started American landscape architecture, and that was based on these sort of cottage style. So now the question is shifting your perspective and your approach.
Yeah.
Okay, I like that. Now, how do I make that of this place? Yeah. Right? How do I, and there's going to be trial and error, but the error is your best teacher.
Yeah. Okay. So if you were, going to give one resource for, the us's of the world who don't know much about, this kind of whole world of landscape, where is somewhere that we could go as a starting point to kind of begin to learn about some of these little touch points,
Whew. That's sort of a big question. I mean, there's wonderful, again, the Wildflower Center has a bunch of
that's great
of information. There's other organizations like that are great resources. And there's folks like Chris Heltzer from the Nature Conservancy, Benjamin Vogt, who's a wonderful author and does restoration as well. I wish I could spout a ton off the top of my head.
Great.
I'm working on a book about pocket prairies. For hopefully for Texas A&M Press if they approve it.
Come on,
but
it's fantastic.
Yeah. So there's during the 80s and 90s, the first push which Miss Johnson did was just for people to become aware of native plants.
Yeah.
We just knew you went to your thing.
Start there.
Yeah. So that's happened. That's one. Now it's getting these. So we're slowly evolving to okay, how do I do this? So the first thing was just replace that water intensive plant with this in your flower bed. But now we're starting to talk about okay. Now let's talk about I would say Doug Ptolemy. So Nature's Best Hope. He's a wonderful resource. His big thing is that if we restored all the national parks that we hopefully aren't about to sell off across the nation. And brought them back 100% to native, it still wouldn't be enough to help save some of the environmental issues that we have. However, in this day and age of I am one person, what in the world can I do? If this problem is so big, if everybody was to take a third of their yard and do a little bit of restoration on it, collectively, that is a massive impact. Now we're really starting to have that. So that message is great about essentially and empowering, that we are the answer. It's just that and then it gets back to culturally, we've got to start to understand how to do that. So Doug Ptolemy would be another great example, but there's plenty of folks out there that are now talking about this, and the thing is though, you can't be ubiquitous about it because what works here, just like with the green roofs, what works here ain't going to work necessarily for Virginia or for Maine,
right,
or for, Oregon or whatever. Your local resources are really going to be your best. I mean, these folks that I'm mentioning, there's methodology there and approaches that are great, but you're going to need to dig a little bit deeper and take it upon yourself to say, okay, what do I need to do here? What to restore? What does that mean to restore in this neck of the woods?
Yeah. So interesting enough, my wife and I recently, I mean, we've kind of gotten into gardening ourselves. I find it just extremely relaxing, and it's just a way
cathartic.
to, it's just a way to kind of unwind. And I mean, we plant only Texas natives, and mainly because of the our soil condition out where we live. It is very rocky, and so many of the plants that we plant are they love the rocky soil, and they're just low maintenance. They don't use a lot of water, and they're beautiful. So one resource that we've used is the Central Texas Gardner. And I wanted to get into that because you're the host of Central Texas Gardner, right? The PBS show.
Yes,
that's awesome.
I am somewhat. Tom Spencer, I feel he is truly the host. Fortunately, he passed not too long ago. I've kind of been in there doing it for a little bit, but I would always say that he's the host because he was there for over a decade. But yes, I do.
Wild.
Get up there and chat with folks about
Come on.
plants.
How did you get
so
involved with that?
I had started doing the pocket prairie in my house because again, that's what I wanted when I bought the property. Working at the Wildflower Center was wonderful to help me learn about a lot of things. But I started my pocket prairie, had it going, and then we essentially was reached out to, hey, they feature a garden, and they came by and spoke with Bonnie and I. And then afterwards, because I was part of the landscape restoration program at the Wildflower Center, I was in there and interviewed with Tom Spencer, the host, a couple of times, just talk about different things. And I think they noticed pretty quickly I was a fairly loquacious person. But sadly enough, though, Tom ended up having a serious stroke, and that affected his ability to talk. And the producer asked me to come in, and I just was really just to help out because I really love the show.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful resource. It's again,
it's great.
Been here since the 80s.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, Tom, it wasn't something that healed, and it really, it was a severe stroke. So that's sort of how I started. So I'm just hoping at the end of the day, again, I don't feel that I am the host. I feel it's really it's him. It's just a legacy that is can't be surpassed, but I can do him honor, and sort of talking about stuff. There's some shows early on, they asked me to talk, here's your person you're going to be interviewing. We're going to be talking about potpourri. And I was like, I don't know a damn thing about potpourri.
You're like, okay.
Okay.
All right.
But no, it's something you sort of definitely grow into that too. But it's been a lot of fun, and I've been really grateful, and hopefully I won't get voted off the island, so to speak.
Oh, heck no. No, definitely not.
It's been cool to dip our toes into a subject that, I mean, I feel like we could talk about this for a long
That's true.
time.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
very broad, yeah.
It really is, and really interesting, and I'm glad that we got to touch on a couple different pieces of that, and excited to hear about this book of yours that comes out and gets a
hopefully
it
it has to go through a peer review process.
Yeah.
We'll see, but I would say for y'all's listeners too, I think a takeaway of like how as builders, because architects tend to look at their buildings as just the footprint, and then whomever else is going to come in and zhuzh stuff up. And I've taught a number of studios with Professor Nicole Wiedemann at UT School of Architecture, which I've really enjoyed, to help students understand that it's not that. You need to think
She's
about
wonderful.
the site Hippocratic Oath, number one thing, don't do any harm. If you have a healthy landscape, which I know we've sort of discussed, there's a lot of invasives out there. It's not just black and white. There's landscapes that are maybe not 100%, but they're really great. Nonetheless, if you have healthy areas, the number one thing you can do as a builder is protect those. Establish a very clear limits of construction and call those vegetation and soil protection zones. That's going to save you money. That's going to save you heartbreak. That's going to save you SWIP measures. That's going to save you a lot of stuff. That's the simplest thing to help promote biodiversity. And then the second thing is just, I would say when you're looking at the site, make sure that you have good communication with all of your contractors and subcontractors, because I can't tell you how many times on projects we've talked with head honcho folks or crew chiefs or whatever. I get the message, we're not going to do this, we're not going to do that. But that never filters down to the actual crew, or even the crew chiefs. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think communication is one of the things that I've learned is so pivotal. Mm-hmm. And you've got to be like a journalist. You got to tell people, you got to tell them, you got to tell them again. Yeah. Because so many people just see green stuff. I can't tell you if, we won't go in and install anything until we know like the other stuff is done. Or unless we can put up, the Great Wall of China around this so that it will repel all assaults on it. Because just a lot of folks just don't, they don't, the value isn't there for a green thing. You can just replace that. And what we've talked about earlier about these trajectories, like it's, if your goal is biodiversity at the end of the day, it's not as simple as just, I'm going to throw some plants in there, it's done. In restoration, there's research that demonstrates it can take 40 years for those microbes that we were talking about to even start to resemble what a mature, like remnant prairie would be. So we need to take that approach like we do with trees that we mentioned earlier. Like you plant a tree, and you know that you're not going to stand in the shade of that, but you're doing it for a future generation. Right. It's the same sort of thing with the herbaceous component, the grasses, the flowers. Is that we need to start that system and protect it, because it's not going to just be there like that. Restoration is a trajectory; it's not an intervention. Yeah. So just some sound things and communication and understanding that even as a contractor, here, look, I'm focused on getting this thing done. That's great, but also just know enough to know what you don't know, so you can ask the right team members. And if you can assemble an integrated design team or build team, who, again, we talked about when you do this, you're working with a team, that you have folks that are helping you make sure that things occur the right way, that's great. But if you just look at the landscape and as aesthetic, you're going to have issues always.
We talk about that in many different contexts of our work. That's the team mentality is so important just across the site. If you've got, if your window and door people are just focused on the windows and doors, and your stone masons just focused on the masonry, it's just not as good of a product. No. And when you have people giving value to what the other trades are doing, what the other people on the team, it's 10 times out of 10 it's a better product. And I really thought that was interesting what you're talking about in comparison to Greenworth. I totally get the sentiment, and I've seen it before where a green thing's easily replaceable, and especially with something like a green roof where it's towards the end of the project and you've got a lot of other things going on, at that time in the project. How do you keep that safe and make it so it's successful at the end of the day?
Yeah, our biggest problem that we've had since we got it in has been the other trades coming in and turning the power off. Like the AC folks, HVAC folks got to come in, that's great, but it's like wrecking our irrigation controller every time, and then it's turning it off. And it's, so it's just things about, And then it's from my perspective, it's like, okay, how do I need to work with them? So yes, I understand they need to take the power off so they don't electrocute themselves to death.
Right.
High voltage work. But it's like, okay, I'm going to set up signs. I'm going to have a clear line of communication. Say, okay, when you do that, let us know so we can turn this back on so it doesn't just wreck everything. And because I did show up at one point when I was first in about 2 or 3 weeks, and it was really crispy looking. I was like, oh God.
You're like, oh dear.
And we started figuring that out. So again, at the end of the day, it's just some sound stuff that I think in the craft world, we take a lot of things for examples, like how do I do the best thing?
Uh-huh.
And to your point, it's, well, this exercise is actually multiple things that need to line up to come together to reach success.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Perfectly well said. I think that's a great way to wrap up. So, John, I really appreciate your time coming on.
Yeah.
It's been an absolute pleasure to meet you and to talk to you. So I appreciate it.
Thank you all.
Yeah, thanks, man.
Thank you.
Yeah.